Okay. To give a little background on my family background, I'm a niece of Spencer W. Kimball and a cousin of Henry Eyring. I went to elementary school in Berkeley, California, and junior high and high school in Moraga, across the hill. I graduated from Brigham Young University in 1976 with a major in Spanish and a minor in English as a second language. And I went on a mission to Toronto, Canada. And when I returned, taught ESL for 5 years in Utah. And then went to California, back to California to the Los Angeles area. And after completing my master's and doctoral degree at UCLA, I taught ESL or trained ESL teachers at Cal State Fullerton for the past 24 years. My crisis of faith began as a child, and it was not resolved until I was about 46 years old.
Hey, I'm Don Bradley. I am a writer and editor and completing a master's in history at Utah State. I have a bachelor's in history from BYU. I did my first church history research at the LDS archives when I was 17, and I, for some reason, was the only 17-year-old there. I don't know. I sort of gradually accumulated a lot of things that I had found that were different from the perspective that I had started with, and eventually that, to oversimplify greatly, caused a rupture in my faith. And I spent about 5 years in the church still, but not, and mostly active most of that time, but not believing. And then I left the church officially, had my name removed from the records, was out of the church for 5 years, and then through a combination of things that I'll say a little bit more about later, I returned to the church, was rebaptized 3 years ago. And Maxine actually led the music at my baptism, even though she was at the time not a member of the church. I asked the ward mission leader, I said, does the person who leads the music have to be a member of the church? And he said, no. So I didn't mention that she was excommunicated, and I was able to participate in her baptism as well. So we're great friends.
Let's see, you've already heard from me, but I thought I would just add that I was inactive for about 10 years, and then I was excommunicated for 20, so I was kind of out of the church for about 28 years, and I was an active believing member for about 28 years. So half of my life I was in, half of my life was out, and I happened to come back right at the point when they were perfectly equal. And so I feel like I have the perspective of both a lifetime member, a descendant of 18 Mormon pioneers, and I also have the perspective of a convert. And I like that. I mean, I truly feel like both, a lifer and a convert, and it's a nice perspective to have. And the thing that another thing that really helped me was my friendship with Dawn, because in our journeys, which were parallel, and we met each other when we were both kind of out there, doing a lot of critical inquiry, we began these intensive discussions about Joseph Smith and about Mormonism in order to wrestle with our own issues and concerns and questions and doubts. And through that wrestling that Don and I both did, which was very deep and very authentic, I can attest to the fact that his return and my return are absolutely sincere, because we wrestled with everything and we did it for years. And Don helped me to come back by being there and wrestling with me, and he confirmed me when I was baptized.
Well, this answer might be surprising, but so my loss of faith was actually very gradual. It was piecemeal, but before that began, I would say I actually had quite a strong testimony. I had had spiritual experiences that were quite strong. What happened over time was that I came to not trust my own experiences, and I came to reinterpret them as just being, from me, and so perhaps being some sort of illusion rather than being from God.
I was a very devoted, believing member, and I served an LDS mission. And I think the first crack in the picture was when I was serving as a missionary and encountering sexist attitudes towards sister missionaries. That was really hard on me. And I came back a little bit disillusioned, even though I had a very successful mission and really enjoyed myself and had great friendships that I made out there, and am still close to a number of those elders and sisters today. I came back from my mission troubled, really troubled, because I had grown up in a ward and stake where they sort of let me have every leadership position I wanted. And in the mission field, I encountered this brick wall of kind of inequity and subordination that I wasn't used to. So when I came back from my mission, I went to BYU. That's when I delved into all the historical problems and issues. And I actually went through my crisis of faith 10 years before sort of everybody else did in the 90s. In 1981 to 83, I encountered all of the problems that everybody's talking about, historicity, things Joseph did, polygamy, all of it, Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, you name it. And I lost faith in the institution, and I lost faith in the church. And then in 1983, I went through a series of a couple of really difficult surgeries for endometriosis, and I lost my faith in God. So I really went through a complete crisis of faith in the early 80s, which is why I moved into that studio across the street to sort of be alone with my faith crisis. I think I lost the original question. What else did you want me to?
Well, I think that hits on it.
What's
Janet?
that? Oh, okay.
I'd say my faith crisis was definitely not a behavioral thing, like I really want to smoke, or that I had any kind of social misgivings about the bishop or someone in the ward that I didn't like. Mine was really an intellectual one, and I don't think there was any event per se that caused the crisis, but I think it resulted from the fact that I was a seeker from a very early age. I was raised in Berkeley, California, in the Berkeley First Ward, and if you knew that era, people like Hugh Nibley, Richard Anderson, and Spencer Palmer were all in that ward and kind of set the tone for academic discussion. It seemed a natural part of things in the church to me. My mother was also a very inquisitive person. So critical thinking always, from a young age, went hand in hand with the spiritual matters. And I guess one could say I was a doubter and a contrarian from a really early age. My husband has said kind of an analysis paralysis is my problem. And so I think that's been with me since about age 11 or 12. I remember asking my parents questions like, did Joseph Smith actually see God? Why is a true book, a book like the Book of Mormon, so boring? A true book, how could it be so boring? Why does it include identical sections to the Bible? How can Uncle Spencer Kimball be a prophet when he seems normal, just like you and me? I ended up going to BYU majoring in Spanish, and I remember being asked by my BYU bishop to come out of the audience and bear my testimony, and I know he was anticipating a very strong testimony from an I-ring. And honest person that I stood up and said that I thought that the church was true, but I wasn't quite sure. And before I could say much more, I was pulled away from the podium like a stage actor with the vaudeville hook, probably to keep me from doing any further damage that day. I went on a mission to Toronto, Canada, in hopes of securing a real testimony, and I put my whole heart and soul into it, sincerely loving the Canadians and even the anti-Mormon ones who packed me with information about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon that I had never heard before. And there I felt that I received an answer to prayer, that Joseph Smith was a fraud and the church was not true. And I asked my mission president to allow me to go home 3 months early because I was really feeling like a hypocrite. He persuaded me to stay, and I'm very grateful for that. But that was the beginning of my journey of 20 years outside the church.
So it was in my history research making new findings that were different from what I had understood and what I thought that things should be, and not knowing how to reconcile those. And also, as I mentioned earlier, just basically losing faith in revelation, so that I thought that there was basically just one way of knowing, and that way was intellectual analysis. And so if I couldn't show that something was true in that way, then I felt like I really had no reason to believe it.
I don't think that I was any different from any other Mormon, except I might have been just a little bit more earnest, a little more analytical, a little less emotional. And I'd been taught that the glory of God is intelligence, and that we should seek for truth, and the Mormon Church holds the truth. And isn't this the substance of every testimony meeting? Someone saying that they know the church is true. So to me, it's no wonder that a well-educated Mormon could lose her faith if key points that had been taught were modified and had to be rethought. Actually, that came later, but at the time it seemed like maybe things were not so true as I'd been taught them to be. And it didn't matter how nice Mormons were. I always liked Mormons. That wasn't the problem, or how strongly family members believed. That wouldn't be enough to keep me in the church. I needed my own knowledge. I was disturbed by discoveries like the multiple first vision stories, Joseph Smith, the glass looker, and similarities of the Masonic ceremonies and the temple. And I have to say, I was invited to be on this panel, and I'd never read Michael Ash's book, but I read it before I got here. And I have to say that book, Shaken Faith Syndrome, does a very good job of describing the cognitive dissonance that I felt, and it details all of my problematic areas, and actually more. So coincidentally, I think he's right on to something for people like me.
You know, it's a curious thing how some people can encounter all of the same information, faith-destroying, testimony-destroying information, and it's not an issue for them at all. I mean, it doesn't even take them to that place, and other people become consumed with that search. And it's not easy to categorize because it doesn't fall along the lines of sort of scholarly or intellectual versus non-scholarly, and it doesn't fall along the lines of people who are inquisitive and driven versus people who take things more easily and are carefree. It's really hard to figure out why some people just are not provoked and engaged by that information and others are. And I just know that some people really have to wrestle with things and sort of take them all the way down to the ground and wrestle until you're just spent, and other people just don't. And I don't have an answer for that. But yeah. I was someone who had to wrestle with stuff.
So what initiate, probably, I think maybe a complex person or something, because my journey is so crazily complex, but so they were all different stages. But I think really the first step back toward the church was just in recognizing the good that and having to acknowledge to myself the good that it did in the lives of other people around me. For instance, my friend Brian Hales, whom I think is out there signing books right now, I was doing some work for him, and he was just so generous, and I recognized how much the gospel gave him peace in his life. I also started to take seriously again the idea that there were other ways of knowing than just analysis, that there might be spiritual ways of gaining truth. And as I continued to dig deeper into church history, I kind of dug through all these layers of difficult things, and finally I got down to where the gold was. I found really beautiful, good things in church history that helped me to return.
Well, I kind of just talked about this for an hour. Oh, is that working? No? Satan's in the microphone. There we go. Let's see, what was I going to say? I already talked about this for the last hour, but I will say that for me, it was bigger than me. It was larger. It was larger forces in my life and recognizing them, and it was God working in my life and my sense of destiny. I'm very much aware of my life, and I try to encourage other people to look at their lives this way because I think it's true of all of us. But I'm very aware of my life as sort of something that's destined, that has a pattern and a purpose to it. And I'm always, trying to understand the current circumstances of my life in light of the larger purpose and destiny. So every step of the way in my life, when I was Mormon, and then when I was disillusioned and inactive, and then when I was excommunicated, and then when I was pursuing ministry studies and interfaith studies and all of that, I was always seeking to understand, am I on my path? Is this where I'm supposed to be? Is this my destiny? And I have always felt guided and led in that way. So my return to the church, I would have to say, was really prompted by God, and larger forces and my own sense of destiny, and recognizing the signs and recognizing that it was time to come back, and recognizing the divine hand in that directing me, that this was the next phase of my journey and my destiny.
Excellent. Excellent. Jen and Irene?
I wanted to just fill in just a little bit. After I decided the church wasn't true, I pretty much left cold turkey. I didn't have many associations. There were a few Sunstone friends that I kept in touch with. I was also a target of some born-again Christian evangelical missionaries that you may or may not know, but they're in Utah County looking for people just like us. But I continued my spiritual search. I didn't give up believing in God. Made associations with Jews and Hindus and Muslims and Protestants, wanting to learn what I could. I actively spoke against the Mormon Church whenever I got a chance, criticized the leaders, the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, and I believe that most Mormons were deluded, simple-minded, and self-righteous. So you can see my arrogance here, I think. But who helped? I think that was your question. It wasn't so much that I felt guilty about breaking commandments, because in fact I had felt that I had received an answer to leave the church. But I do feel that just kind of living and experiencing things, that I felt the natural effect of my poor choices. I'd missed opportunities for service, lost the chance to have children, experienced weakened ties, and I think had many sins of omission, which I was aware of. Not so much commission, but things that weren't getting taken care of. And so I was just going to say there were four key people for me. A friend of mine who was involved in Sunstone was the only Mormon I really knew that I could contact, and he invited me to meet some other single friends who were Mormons. And with him, I had a glimmer of hope that I could begin to retrieve, rethink, and repair what had been seriously broken over time. And then I had a brother-in-law who came to Southern California, and he somehow suggested that I go to a church dance. And that seemed a lot easier than going to a 3-hour meeting. So I did go there, and I did discover some codependent and mentally ill people, but But more than that, I actually saw some older singles like myself who had also experienced the pains and disappointments of life. Those never married, others divorced, widowed, others disabled, yet all seeking to find answers in a community of believers. And I felt deeply humbled by that experience. And then believe it or not, I had a home teacher who would not give up. He and his wife came regularly for several years. The church always finds you, it seems, where you are. And they gave me the courage to just try a sacrament meeting and have a place to sit. It was very, very uncomfortable doing that. But at that point, I began to see an opening that maybe I could become active, and I did make an appointment with my bishop and tearfully repented of what I then reanalyzed to be immature, naive, and simplistic, reaching beyond the mark view of the gospel of Christ. Every question didn't need to be tidily answered when seeing through a glass darkly was all most of us ever get. And when I came to myself, if you think of the prodigal son in Luke 15, when I realized I had sinned against heaven and that I was dead, and I was dead spiritually, I felt alive again because I was lost and now I was found. And I assure you, those words during my anti-Mormon days, they would never have crossed my lips. At age 48, I married a Mormon, a faithful Mormon, because I didn't intend to ever leave the church again. And it's too painful to remember the old life, and I'm too happy in my new one learning to love people in the church of all ethnic backgrounds, all ages, all walks of life. The church is a marvelous community.
Sure. So one thing which I mentioned already is just being open to other ways of knowing, like spiritual ways of knowing. Another was not trying to put God in my box, like where not saying that God has to operate within certain parameters or I won't believe that it's God. You know, God, I'm content now to let God be God and I'll be done, right? And like however he wants to work is up to him. And so I'm not setting up arbitrary, artificial boundaries that I use to say, no, this can't be God's way. Also, really becoming open to new questions. Questions, anytime you ask a question, it focuses your attention somewhere. And the questions that I was asking, they weren't getting me anywhere. They were keeping me where I was, and not very happy at that. And they were giving me a view, like in my research, I was asking questions about Joseph Smith, who's the primary object of my research. Like cynical questions, like, you know, kind of like what was in this for him, about anything that he did. And, you know, think about it, if with anyone that you know, if you were to always have the question in mind, with everything that person did, what's in it for him or what's in it for her? You know, what would your relationship be like? How would you end up viewing that person? And so I needed to expand out and ask different questions. And also essential for me with that was I think it's remarkable what can change as we become happier. Like I'm so much happier now than I was, you know, when I'd lost my faith. And part of that has been the return and the place that I'm at. But part of that change of my growing in happiness happened first. And I think that was really essential because when we're unhappy, we tend to get focused on, that focuses us on negative things. And we get ourselves trapped in that. And what had happened is I started working on becoming a more grateful person, just gratitude journaling, thinking about the people that I was grateful to. And as I started to become happier, I was able to think more clearly and see more possibilities in my life, including in my faith. And ways that things that I hadn't thought before could work actually could work.
Ooh, what kind of assumptions lead to a loss of faith? I think that's really unique. It's different for different people. Like I was saying earlier, it's really hard to know or predict what is going to be a trigger for somebody because we're all such complex beings and we relate to information in different ways. So I have a hard time answering that question. I think you've stumped me, Bill. I want to go back to the other one, the previous question, if I can. Is that okay? Can I go back to the other one? Yeah, I like it better. My framework and paradigm had changed so many times during that 28 years. I had started out, a true believer, and then went through the shattering of everything, church and God, and was an atheist for about 7 years. And then I was agnostic for 3 years. And the issues were literalistic issues, historical issues. Everything was literalistic, If things didn't literally line up, then I wasn't going to believe them. And I shifted into the realm of symbol and transcendence and really understanding the symbolic and the archetypal and the psychological realm. So it was kind of a shift from sort of the materialistic to the psychological. And once I shifted into the psychological realm, things started making a lot more sense. And Mormonism got a whole lot more interesting for me when I was looking at it through a Jungian lens and a Jungian view. I began to see Joseph Smith as a perfect example of someone who was entering the divine, transcendent, and collective unconscious doorway within himself every day. I mean, Joseph Smith is someone who was entering that collective unconscious and his higher self and his transcendent self constantly, sort of 24/7, and trying to bring back information and vision and insights and put them into material form constantly, into text and scripture and organizations and buildings. So that was really powerful for me. And then I shifted, as Dawn was describing, into really the spiritual paradigm, where I realized that religion and a relationship with God is really about the spiritual. It's beyond the physical, it's beyond the psychological, it's really in the realm of spirit. And that's a whole different realm to be operating in. And that's what brought me back, because I see the divine inhabiting and operating and living through the church. And I remember I used to attend the Christmas concert, the Tabernacle Choir Christmas concert every December with the Interfaith Roundtable. And this was before I came back to the church, but I had shifted into that spiritual paradigm where I'm trying to perceive things spiritually rather than being focused on them temporally. And there were times when I was sitting in the audience and I experienced a visionary experience when the Tabernacle Choir was singing, that I experienced realms of angels around them and singing with them. And I'll never forget one year, I think it was the Audra McDonald year, I was so completely undone by the experience, so overwhelmed with what I had seen with my spiritual eyes, that I couldn't stop crying. I was just sobbing, sloppily all over myself. And I went downstairs to get my coat after it was all over, and there was an usher standing there, and she was sobbing too. And we both looked at each other, and we didn't even have to say anything. We had both seen the same thing. And we both knew we'd seen the same thing. And I'll never forget that experience. So I think, as Joseph's, showed us, if we open our spiritual eyes, there are things to be learned and seen that we haven't even begun to appreciate.
I think definitely for oneself and for your family, it's important that we legitimize the doubting Thomases amongst us, that they have a place in our wards and they're there. Also that Doctrine and Covenants states that some of us have testimonies to know Jesus Christ as the Son of God, others to believe on those who know. And I think, again, they have a legitimate place. I am uncomfortable with shadow of a doubt testimonies. I guess I would love to see a little more tolerance for testimonies where people could just say, I believe, and I sure think this is correct because of my life's experience, and that would be also inspiring. For me, I found the New International Version of the Bible really helpful when I was coming back because of its very good common day English. I could see Christ in his teachings a little more easily. And I also gained a lot from Richard Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, and he helped me to know that Joseph Smith was an honest man and not a charlatan, as I had thought. Last comment, my aunt, Camilla Eyring Kimball, I remember talking to her during my struggle, and she had said, you've got to embrace the good in the gospel, and there's questions, you need to shelve those. That's what I do for later reflection when things aren't clear or they don't appear to be, or they appear to be contradictory. And don't throw the baby or the church out with the bathwater.
I think one thing that might be helpful for people with family members who are maybe have lost their faith would be to recognize that there are, in my experience, stages that people go through in this. And so at first, often, if someone has lost their faith, they're maybe angry, Mormonism creates a very strong sense of identity. And so sometimes if people lose their faith and they feel like they need to break out of that identity, then they feel like they need to do and say things to sort of act against it. And so they may think it's hilarious to say obscene things about general authorities like everyone on the Recovery from Mormonism board does. Or, they will go out and have their first cup of coffee or whatever. But these things are stages. And I would say also not to condemn and not to go back to the stereotypical thing of, well, what's your secret sin that you're wanting to commit or whatever. If someone says that they're having intellectual doubts, take that seriously. I had very serious intellectual doubts. And a question that I would raise maybe for people as we're here at an apologetics conference is if nobody really loses their faith over intellectual issues, why do we have apologetics? Because apologetics is intellectual defense of the faith. But if nobody lost faith over intellectual issues, we wouldn't need intellectual defense of the faith. We'd just all get together here and bear testimonies. And so, we know in here that intellectual issues and intellectual defense matters, and I hope we'll take that knowledge out when we leave and use that knowledge as we approach other people who are having doubts.
Maxine.
It's not too close again, right? I don't know. Okay. It's their journey. I would not try to impose my journey and my paradigm onto somebody else. And it goes both ways. Whether you're an angry ex-Mormon and trying to shock and destabilize and hurt those who have belief, or whether you're a believer who is putting guilt and invalidation and disowning, someone who's left. We just can't oppress people with our journey and our paradigm. And I really believe, in fact, I'll say I have a testimony that, I really believe that we look at our lives before we come down here, there's a map written in our soul. And we are the only ones who can find it and know it. And when you're on your path, your inner invisible path, and you know when you're not. And sometimes that path takes you places that you never thought you would go and that other people don't understand, and yet you have to be true to your inner, I think, map. And because there are things you need to learn and strengths that you need to gain from that journey. So don't judge each other, just love them, love each other. No matter where they are, love them. People loved me the whole time I was out. And I have so many friends and loved ones who are out, and I love them. And I have friends on the RFM board. Steve Benson and I are close friends. Nobody can understand it. In fact, he wants me to come on RFM and talk about why I came back, because RFM was talking for 3 days about the fact that I'm speaking at Fair, and they're all dying to know why in the world I went back. So after being with all of you, I have to go face RFM now. But Steve and I love each other as friends, and we could not be further apart on our views on the church. So love them. Love them.
Sure. My faith is definitely much more flexible. I'm less certain that the right answer has to be a certain way. Before I lost my faith, I would have told you that I was never going to lose my faith. But I would have said that in ignorance of really what the potential challenges to faith were. And I can say it now, really knowing what those are, having delved into them deeply. Terrell Givens used this phrase in a recent news article. He talked about a faith that absorbs doubt, and I like that. In coming back to the church, I don't feel like I've had to give up my awareness of the negative things in church history or Mormon culture or whatever, but those are put in the context of this larger perspective where I just see so much good that those other things are just overwhelmed. And so it's not a matter of denying or turning a blind eye to the negatives, but really opening my eyes to the beauty and the positives.
Excellent. Janet?
I would agree that having kind of been out of the church, and I was stubborn and had to go that route, but you choose to come back, and so it's a richer experience. I often cry during sacrament meetings, and people, what's she crying about? But the scriptures are coming alive, and maybe because you see your own self, your fallen or your flawed self in scriptures that you didn't really see when you were younger.
That's a tough one.
If we claim to be the true church, go. If you must go and search and find, and in my case, it led back to the church. You're gonna maybe take some risks, and there can be pain and problems, but you got to do what you got to do, I think.
The idea of anyone leaving the church is painful to me. I do feel like in my own life there were lessons I wasn't going to learn any other way than how I did. But I would say rather than take that huge step of leaving the church, from which it's much more difficult to come back to the church after you've left than it is to stay in and work on things. And so maybe, hopefully, there will be some ideas that have been given today or that you can acquire from someone else or some other source that can help you to work through things from where you're at right now and stay.
It's changed the way I teach young women's on Sunday. In every Relief Society class and every Young Women's class, I'm looking for the deeper information that we've missed in the women's stories. And, for example, in talking about priesthood, I talked about Moses and Aaron, but then I focused the whole lesson on Miriam and how she was a prophet too, and all three of them led the children of Israel. So I'm doing a bit of feminist theology, but within the bounds of, I rely on Scripture. I'm excavating those texts, and I'm pulling out the feminine authority and power that is buried there that we have not seen. So I would say excavating is my mantra, and that's what